Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this fifth event in the Russia's World Series at the Harriman Institute this year, where over the course of the year, we've looked at Russia and the Soviet Union in international and global context and in relation to different parts of the world, other empires, international practices and systems of thought, and today a region and a sea and an economy and an environment. And at the mutual influence of Russia and the Soviet Union on these worlds, on the construction of them, and their influence on the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. So I just want to say that our sixth and final event of the series this year will be on Thursday, April 15th, at a different time of 2 p.m. on the Second World War and its aftermath with Francine Hirsch and Michael David Fox. So please join us for that. So before I introduce our presenters and panelists today, I just first want to make a statement of solidarity with the graduate workers and all student workers of Columbia who are on strike. We're on strike because the university continues to refuse to provide us with a fair contract covering the cost of living and the work that we do, or adequately covering our health insurance, or providing us with basic worker protections against discrimination and harassment. The university continues to intimidate and to retaliate against us by attempting to dock our pay, to remove stipends from strikers, and to surveil and encourage reporting on those who are on strike. This event is not connected to any of our duties as graduate workers. We organized this ourselves on our own initiative. It's sort of like what we like to do anyway, and so it's not in violation of the strike. But we do encourage you and everyone in attendance today to support the graduate student workers at Columbia during our strike in any way that you can. So today we are joined by two great presenters, Bathsheba Demuth, who is Assistant Professor of History and Environment and Society at Brown University, where she's also an affiliated faculty member in Native American and Indigenous Studies and Science and Technology Studies. She's an environmental historian whose research focuses on the lands and seas of the Russian and North American Arctic, and on how the histories of people, ideas, places, and non-human species intersect. Her first book, Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait, examined capitalist and socialist attempts to transform the northern borderlands of both countries, while her new research turns to the Yukon River watershed and how rights for non-human beings have been conceived and codified across indigenous, imperial, and nation-state traditions. And Professor Demuth talk today will examine the Soviet Union's industrial whaling program in the North Pacific in the context of the Cold War, the growth of environmentalism, and other nations' whaling programs. Ilya Vinkovetsky is our second presenter today. He is Associate Professor in the History Department at Simon Fraser University. His book, Russian America, an Overseas Colony of a Continental Empire, dealt with Alaska as a colony within the Russian Empire, the relations between Russian colonists and North American First Nations, and the reasons for the decision to sell Alaska to the United States in the 1860s. Today, though, he will talk about the Russian American Company in the context of global colonial studies, asking what was the place of the Russian American Company among the otherwise Western European-based colonial companies, and what rule by a corporate contractor suggests about Alaska under Russian imperial rule. So Ilya is going to present first, then as our usual format, Bathsheba will present, and then we will have a sort of discussion between the two of them, which I think will be really productive today, based on the kind of successive episodes of exploitation and exploration of the Arctic or the North Pacific. And then we will open it up to a Q&A from the audience. And so please feel free at any time to put questions into the Q&A, and then we will get to them. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Ilya Vinkovetsky.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm honored to be invited to the series. It's great to be with you on the East Coast from the West Coast. I'm speaking to you from British Columbia right now. Um, um, wish you all the very best with that, with the strike, of course, and I hope everything works out as well as it can. Okay, all right. So today I'll be talking about the Russian American company in a different way than I did in my book. Let's say in my book I talked about when I talked about Russian America as a colony of an empire. I focused on the Russian American company as a contractor of empire, and I use that phrase, contractor, and I still have a lot of allegiance to that formulation, because the Russian American company indeed had charters that were 20-year charters on which it operated. But I want to highlight some other things about Russian American company today and its creation, its foundation, and its, in a way, its status within the Russian American company in the context of some of the other colonial companies that were, like, with the exception of Russian American company, really Western European based. In other words, they were headquartered in places like London and Amsterdam and Paris, and also had their colonial sphere. And I would call this interaction between the center and the periphery through the colonial companies. I call it the imperial cultural filter. In other words, how you get things from, from decisions being made in St. Petersburg to their implementation or lack thereof in Alaska and vice versa. What in a time before many modern, before the telegraph, before many modern communications methods were invented. So there's a huge communications lag, and in this way, I want to rely on some of the so there's a lot of work that has been done in the recent decade about the colonial companies, beginning especially with Philip Stern's excellent book, The Company State, which is about the East India Company and its rule over, and it's the practice of corporate sovereignty that it practiced in India, right? So the actual operation of India by the rule of it by colonial company. At the same time that it talks obviously about the company as a business. It's something that is different from the rest of the British state. So what I'd like to say, this is in contrast to a lot of literature that has been produced over the years about Russian America as a place where the Russian American company essentially is presented to us often in the works of good scholars, very good scholars, as an extension of Russia's government, more or less. As a, in the phrase of one work, department of the Russian government. The Russian American company is just another department, infiltrated later by the Navy, for example, naval officers. What I'd like to say is that I think my research, and this is comes from a recent article that I submitted, shows that the Russian American company was always viewed by the imperial government with suspicion and from some distance. So, except for those people in the Russian government who were intimately involved and invested in the company, most of the Russian government their officials viewed the Russian American company as something that is quite different from the rest of the imperial apparatus, if you will, and that comes from the very beginning, because the Russian American company was arguably. Some people would say it was the very first corporation, corporaция, that existed in the Russian Empire. And this is significant because, people often talk about, that there are many examples in Russia of the company giving, given the right to exploit its frontier, not the company, the empire, to businesses and to private individuals. Famously all over Siberia and before that in the old Russian Empire, in the Urals, and so lots of the expansion of Russia actually occurred because of quote unquote private initiative, and the state had to chase down some of this private initiative. So private people. However, what's different about the Russian-American company, right, is that just to remember what it was a joint stock company that was that did not have a single owner. Obviously, it had a board, and the management was separated from, if you could say, the ownership. There were of course owners who had voting rights in the company, and they included government officials, but they also included merchants. And eventually, there were more people from the government, less merchants. But all the while, it was a corporation, and in this way, and just to read you a recent example from just a book that just came out last year, which took the company state model and some of these other models and talked about corporations in European history. So this is from Ron Harris's book, Going the Distance. This is his definition of an early modern corporation: an artificial person or legal entity created by or under the authority of the laws of state, composed of an association of numerous individuals, having a legal personality and legal existence distinct from that of its several members, and which is by the same authority vested with the capacity of continuous succession, irrespective of death of members or changes in membership, either in perpetuity or for a limited term of years, and of acting as a unit in matters relating to the common purpose of the association, such as buying, selling, and owning property, contracting with others, suing, or being sued in court. Okay, so what I mean here is that unlike the rest of the Russian Empire, the Russian American company was, for most of its existence, an independent, not an independent, I would say, but a semi-independent company, and it was in a sense like kind of like a joint venture between the government, to use a more modern term, between the government and the state. And in many ways, that relationship is not unique to Russia, right? So Hudson's Bay Company, for example, in Britain, was also enmeshed in government affairs in some ways, and in some points it was, for one point it was told to merge, for example, with the Northwest Company, and it did so. And so I guess the other thing I'd like to stress is that the Russian American company, when it was founded in the 1790s, and it was established in 1799 out of the United American Company, which was its immediate predecessor, and already a united company that united all the merchants, is that primarily when the college Commerce-College in St. Petersburg was discussing its formation, they used the language of, we need to be like the Europeans, we need to have these European style corporations, and they specifically referred to East India type companies, and this is documented in their discussions. But they use them in a way as a kind of I would say, they never really specifically said we need to do this and that. We need to do some specific things from the companies. Like, for example, they didn't have a limited liability the way that for the Russian American company established, as the way that was pretty much the rule for all the Western European companies. It's only in 1821 that the Russian American company got limited liability rights. But nonetheless, but what's interesting in the 1790s is that it was the merchants themselves, the Siberian merchants, who had been before that competing with each other in exploiting the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, and who had been, there for a long time, kind of, exterminating the sea otters and the fur seals and interacting, who basically came to the belief, the more ambitious of them, by the 1790s, that they could not compete with the British and the Americans who were coming there increasingly after the James Cook voyage and its aftermath. There were more and more people coming there to get the valuable furs of the region from the native peoples, and not respecting the so-called the claims of the Russian Empire. And so because they could no longer finance these ventures, which cost a lot of money, there was a long log in terms of like getting money from actually earning money and bringing it back to the empire and monetizing this. They were the ones who basically, you can say, made a pitch to the government and asked the government to interfere and to form a united monopolistic company that would be in control of the strait. Now, I'm simplifying here vastly, to be fair, that there were some who were against it, some for it, but in general, the feeling among the more ambitious of these merchants was that they could not do this without government support. They could not. And so the idea of actually funding a kind of a company that would be a monopolistic company that would become a corporation that would pool all the resources together and that would be able to call on government support and get subsidies for the government when needed, although that was not always the case, was something that the merchants were very eager to establish. And their agent of the merchants, ultimately, Ryazanov, was the one who helped write the charter itself, the Russian-American Company charter within the Commerce College. And and it took them a while to get this project across. And certainly the final outcome was a kind of a hybrid between a Russian-based old-style company and the Western companies that would come about, that they modeled not I wouldn't say, I use the word model in my book, but I would say they mimicked some of the Western companies in the creation, the actual creation of the Russian-American Company. And they use that as a kind of as a way to say, this is why Russia needs to do this, as well as these other things, in order to have this. So to have this mechanism of imperial control or in the colonies, in an overseas colony, in which Russian imperial rule was very tenuous, according to their own definition of how it was done. And so I would say also that this was from the point of view of imperialism, let's put it this way, efficiency of imperialism, pretty much given the resources that they invested in, that the Russian Empire at the time was willing to invest in exploiting this faraway colony, was a pretty efficient way of delegating imperial authority, outsourcing it in a sense to in the colonies. So in other words, the company becomes a kind of an instrument of the imperial state. In a way, I would say, just to give you a more recent example, like in American imperialism, you have like something like a company like Blackwater in Iraq, which on the one hand is a completely, it's not part of the U.S. government. It's a contractor. It's its own entity. So if a Blackwater employee commits some crime, it's the Blackwater's responsibility. If a Blackwater employee dies, it's not necessarily reported in the press because it's not really a U.S. military official that dies. So it's kind of like keeping its imperialism at a kind of a distance and on a leash on the one hand, but it's also what's important here is that there's a kind of a line that is drawn, and that I'm not talking about Blackwater anymore, but Russian-American Company specifically, between the company and the empire. It's not a straightforward department. It's not a straightforward part of the government, but it's a part that can easily be cut off and blamed for when it commits something that the empire does not desire. And at the same time, when the empire does get some benefit from it, it can be endorsed and the results can be incorporated in the imperial sphere. Okay, there's much more I can say, but I'm going to leave it at this point. And when we have questions, we can talk about more. The other thing I want to say is that there have been just the books that I mentioned, like Philip Stern, obviously is very important in this, the company state book. although that using East India Company is a little bit misleading as a paradigmatic company of the time, because it was the only company, it was sort of an extreme company of, if you will, of kind of in terms of efficiency and what was able to accomplish. And if you look at other British companies like the Muscovy Company, which was the second most profitable company at the time, and the Dutch East India Company and other companies, it becomes clear that Russian American Company is very much in line with some of these other companies in what they do, and it's pretty successful if you consider that it succeeds, that it's there all the way from 1799 to the 1870s. After Alaska is sold in 1967, it continues to exist for a number of years, although it's already pretty much a dead entity at that point. But certainly through that time of actually like maintaining Russian rule in a distant company at a relatively low expense and having only 700 employees or less at a time, it was pretty efficient as a imperial agent, you could say. Okay, on this note, I will end, and I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was great, Ilya. And now, Bathsheba Demuth.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam and Ilya. Thank you, Carly, for the invitation. And I just want to take a moment to offer my solidarity to the grad students on strike at Columbia now. As the graduate of a unionized campus, I have very much benefited from those supports and hope that you are able to earn them. I'm going to share my screen with a caveat that if you're really squeamish, my apologies. If you're eating lunch right now, also my apologies. I'm going to be talking about the Soviet whaling program. In some ways, touching on some similar themes to what Ilya was talking about, but it is also necessarily a pretty gory topic. And the Soviet whaling program is something that's kind of coming to the attention of researchers. I wrote a couple of chapters about it in my book, and Ryan Tucker-Jones has a book coming out next year that's about the whaling program kind of in full, particularly about the Antarctic. So if this whets your appetite, look for Ryan's book, which is coming soon. So what I'm going to talk about today is about the kind of Soviet relationship with cetacean species, with whales around the world, particularly in the North Pacific, and for the most part in the 1950s to the 1970s. So it's in part a Cold War story, in that it's about a clash of human values. And it's also a hot war story if you take the perspective of the whales. In the decades I discuss here, the tally of whales killed by human beings would reach almost 3 million. The Soviet whaling program is what I'm going to focus on, with a little side of the kind of American responses to it at the end. And thinking kind of throughout the talk about the ways in which the value of what a whale is was kind of always up for discussion, both by the Soviet Union and in its relationship kind of in the Cold War context with the United States. So the Soviet whaling program begins in the 1930s in the North Pacific, off the coast of Kamchatka and Chukotka. The Russian Empire had kind of tried to have a whaling industry, in some ways because they were looking at what the United States was doing in the North Pacific and the Bering Sea, but it had been very small scale. But in the 1930s, the Soviet Union buys its first kind of 20th century industrial factory whaler, this ship called the Aluit. And it was a very small program. In the 30s, it killed a few hundred whales at a time. And the purpose of the program, in addition to bringing in whale oil and other whale products, was to kind of prove the ways in which socialist whaling could be different and distinct from capitalist whaling. Many of the captains and crew involved in the Aluit in these first years were residents of the Russian Far East. So they were very aware of the history, the 19th century history of large-scale capitalist whaling in the North Pacific and the Bering Sea that had nearly extirpated bowhead whales and gray whales and right whales. So there was a strong belief that capitalist whaling was irrational, which is pretty hard to deny, given what it had done to several cetacean species. And Soviet marine biologists in particular put together kind of sort of coda for what they hoped to see from their own whaling fleet that would use more of the animal, not just the fat, but also the meat, the bones, the organs, and that would not kill to excess. They would pay attention to the kind of ways in which whale biology operates, where whale populations were more accessible or less. So it was kind of what you might call a conservationist program at the beginning. It saw a need for killing whales to help people in various ways, but wanted to put limits on it. These kind of early thoughts about what the whaling program should look like start to change during the Second World War, for reasons that will be familiar to anybody who knows very much about the Russian situation during the Second World War. This is a time of extreme caloric distress across the Soviet Union, as the war effort pulls in, people who are involved in agricultural production, the requirements of troops who need lots of particularly fat in order to be effective members of the armed services. And at some point during the war, the captain of the fleet in the Far East writes to Stalin and says, one way that we can solve this crisis of fat is to start harvesting more whales. However, during the war itself, this expansion of the whaling program does not come to pass. And in fact, globally, the whaling programs of other industrial countries like Germany, Great Britain, and Norway are also more or less suspended due to the hostilities. And marine biologists who in the last couple of years have learned that if you look at the earwax in whales, you can see what years they're the most stressed because of the cortisol levels that are held in that wax, have noted that during the Second World War, whale stress went down because they were not being hunted. People were so distracted by hunting each other that it was actually a much better time to be a whale in the 20th century. The kind of idea of increasing the kind of capacities of the Soviet whaling fleet outlasts the Second World War. And the Soviet Union actually is the recipient of some German whaling vessels as part of the kind of post-war redistribution of German treasure, and really ramps up the whaling program by the 1950s. And this includes these very large factory fleets that are able to kill virtually any species of whale. So humpback whales, killer whales, right whales, sperm whales, fin whales, blue whales, bowheads, pretty much anything that swims within harpoon range, they were able to kill. And by the time these whalers really came to hunt the world's oceans, starting in the North Pacific and then expanding into Antarctica, some of the kind of caloric urgency of the Second World War is fading. It's the end of the 1950s into the 1960s, and few Soviet citizens eat whale in any particular quantity. Some used whale fat in their daily lives because it ended up in cosmetics or ended up in organs. Sometimes the bones ended up in fertilizer, but there doesn't appear to have been a massive demand within the Soviet Union for whale products. And yet, between the 1950s and the 1970s, the Soviets kill about 500,000 whales. Why is the question. I'm going to offer three kind of possibilities, which emerge in part out of an incomplete access to the archive. So there may be other answers to this question out there. The first is that Soviet whaling ships were actually spaces in which people participated in something that really felt like real existing socialism. Secondly, whaling on the high seas offered the possibility of beating capitalists at their own game. And third, it was a Soviet activity that kind of exported, moved offshore, literally, the environmental consequences of production, which is something that many Soviet industries in the later parts of the 20th century did not. So in the 1950s, multiple Soviet factory ships, like the ones pictured here, are cruising in the North Pacific, with the Alyut joined by the Sovietskaya Rossiya in 1962, the Vladivostok and the Dalny Vostok a year later. And these are ships that have a kind of central processing ship and many kind of smaller catcher boats that actually go out and do the whale harpooning. These fleets were born in the 21st century, or the 21st Party Congress in 1959, where Khrushchev announced the Soviet Union was in this kind of new stage of history, the period of full-scale building of communism. And the expanded whale fleets are folded into that. And the whale fleets are really useful, particularly for the fishing departments within Gosplan, because whales officially counted as fish, and because killing whales allowed the fulfillment of annual plans in Moscow pretty easily. Because of the new technology, you know, whatever plan Moscow set forward, these fleets were able to fulfill pretty easily. And the fleets themselves were actually quite powerful sort of conduits for the Soviet social ideal. The people working on whaling ships came from all over the Soviet Union. They were kind of multi-ethnic, multi-gender, and sometimes even multi-age collectives. And they did all kinds of work. These fleets would be at sea for months at a time. So they needed dentists and doctors. They needed mechanics. They needed people staffing the libraries. They needed crews who were doing their kind of specific tasks on the catching ships. And they needed people to do the harpooning and to process the whales. So they were very much factories, but also kind of communities. They were company towns at sea. And the work kind of in these company towns in many ways really fit ideals of Soviet labor that go all the way back to Lenin, and the descriptions of having a kind of gifted individual who inspires the collective to go out and struggle for better production. They're in some ways post-war Stakhanovites, because most whales die at the hands of a single harpooner, but to actually get any value from the carcass, you need an entire community of people working together to make that possible. So these whale ships were spaces of individual heroism and collective triumph, kind of in one space. To the point that several years after the kind of end of the Soviet whaling program, one of the whalers on the ship was interviewed in Vladivostok and asked, why he continued to kill whales. And his answer was, well, first, on the whaling ship, as they said at the time, there was communism. So even, at the time, people were thinking about these ships as places where kind of communist ideals played out. However, in order to have these ideals play out, because of the form of the Soviet economy, the number of whales that was demanded from Moscow every year kept going up. And this eventually puts so much pressure on the whale species around the world that it becomes increasingly difficult to kill whales in accordance with that early model that the Soviet Union put forward, one that pays attention to the health of the whale populations and not just to the kind of economic demands of the country. And it also started to run afoul of the limits on industrial whaling put forward by the International Whaling Commission. The IWC is formed right after the Second World War and involves all the major industrial whaling companies, particularly Great Britain and Norway, but also Japan, which becomes a major whaler after the Second World War. And each year, the IWC would put quotas on each kind of nation that was involved in industrial whaling. The Soviet Union was a signatory, regularly participated in IWC meetings, had marine biologists who were reporting to the IWC. But by the 1960s, the whale ships themselves were running into the reality that in order to fill the plans that they were given from Gosplan, they had to kill whales in excess of what the International Whaling Commission had allowed. So what happens is that whaling captains do in fact kill whales far in excess of these IWC rules. One captain recorded in the 1960s, the quote, in total, illegal whales represented 68.3% of whales by number and 48.6% by weight of what the Dalny Vostok killed in 1967. And quote, if the fleet had strictly followed the regulations, the yearly planned target would not have been fulfilled. And these whale deaths did not make it to the International Whaling Commission. KGB agents traveled with each ship and kept a separate set of books that was delivered to the IWC, and an internal set that actually recorded the number of whales killed. And I think that you can, in some ways, see this as a kind of socialist labor, this kind of whaling in excess of what the capitalist world, since all the other signatories of the IWC come from capitalist countries, had put forward, and doing so in the name of the motherland, seems in some of the records to be viewed as something that kind of rights a historical wrong of capitalists killing too many whales, and particularly killing too many whales in waters adjacent to Russia and the Soviet Union in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So it kind of harkens back to this memory of particularly American whalers coming into Russian waters. And it also made Russian whaling do what much industry in the Soviet Union was not able to do, which was export the kind of environmental tolls of industry outside national borders. Particularly by the 1970s, after the passage of the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts in the United States, and similar kinds of legislation in Western Europe, capitalist countries in the global north become very adept at protecting the environments within their national space, while simultaneously benefiting from the kind of mass industrial production that allows for the consumption levels that these countries had become habituated to by offshoring industrial production. So moving the most pollutive, the most dangerous industries to places like India and China, Cambodia, other countries, mostly in the global south. And this is something that the Soviet Union does not participate in to that degree. Soviet citizens very much kind of bear the toil and the toll of these industries within their own countries. And whaling, which was sort of celebrated in the national newspapers, this is an onboard newspaper that kind of celebrates the ways that whalers are, upholding the communist promise, but were also celebrated in their home ports and celebrated in Pravda and other national publications, are able to take that environmental cost and move it outside of Soviet space. And this kind of compounds the desire for the Soviet whaling program to keep whaling in excess, even as marine biologists within the Soviet Union are kind of explicitly telling planners in Moscow and in Vladivostok and other places that the number of whales being killed is far in excess of what whale species are able to keep up with reproductively, that eventually these whaling fleets are going to push whale species towards extinction. I mean, you can get a sense from this map of the kind of density and kind of repeated activity that Soviet whalers were participating in the North Pacific. So this kind of inspires the continuation of the Soviet whaling program through the 1960s, which is a time, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, where the understanding of the environment is changing fairly rapidly in the West. And whales actually end up being kind of key figures in the association between kind of new left movements and environmental movements and the New Age movements in the United States and Canada. And this ends up putting the Soviet whaling program and many kind of environmental activists in North America on a collision course. Some of this has to do with the fact that commercial whaling by capitalist countries, which had actually killed the majority of industrial whale deaths during the 20th century, is starting to retreat. Norway and Britain are no longer killing whales in large numbers by the end of the 1960s, in large part because there are cheaper alternatives. Things like palm oil are actually easier to access. So people in these countries are no longer consuming whales in any regular sense, other than ending up in dog food and lubricating intercontinental ballistic missiles, which I can answer later if anyone's interested. And with whales kind of moved out of the realm of an economic value, they really move into the realm of a kind of mystical, transcendent example of megafauna, a kind of animal that needs particular protection from people because of the history of killing them in large numbers, and because they are seen as kind of agents of enlightenment. They're animals that can teach people how to live better. They're seen kind of as these newly peaceful mystical beings. Some of this comes with the publication of Farley Moet's book, A Whale for the Killing, the release of a recorded album of humpback whale songs, which actually tops the charts for a while, is a big piece of kind of pedagogy around the idea that whales are communicative and social animals, and whale watching as a kind of vacation pastime really takes off in the United States. So there's this general cultural turn toward valuing whales alive. And it takes kind of one of its most sort of direct and precise forms in the activists in Greenpeace, who originally formed to be an anti-nuclear organization to try to support nuclear disarmament. But when they learned that whale parts were used to lubricate intercontinental ballistic missiles, kind of conclude that the fates of cetaceans and humans were very much linked, and start trying to directly disrupt industrial whaling. And this leads to the small boat piloted by Greenpeace kind of going out to confront a Soviet whaler off the coast of California in 1973. Greenpeace had received the coordinates for where the Soviets were whaling from the Defense Department. The Defense Department thought the whaling ship was actually just a spy front and wanted to kind of move them away from American waters. Greenpeace took advantage of this and went out to kind of get between this Soviet whaling ship and the sperm whales that they were trying to kill at the time. And this led to a great, kind of a fascinating, if I unfortunately rather I don't have a lot of reports from the Soviet side of this interaction, but kind of a cross-cultural moment where the Greenpeace activists were putting themselves between the harpoons and the sperm whales, and produced a several years long set of altercations between the Soviet whaling fleet whenever it got sort of close enough to the North American shore for the Greenpeace activists to try to interrupt its work. And this, by the later 1970s, starts to offer the Soviet Union yet another reason to withdraw from whaling. Some of it was because other whaling nations had, so the sense of kind of competition with the capitalist world was fading. Some of it was simply because there were no longer so many whales in the ocean. It was very difficult to make plan, even if you were whaling in excess of the IWC rules by the late 1970s, because of the damage done to global whale populations. So that kind of ability to fulfill Soviet promise became less and less accessible. And then you had these men in rubber boats who would come up and sing songs at you while trying to get between you and whales on the regular. And this kind of combination of events meant that in 1979, the USSR withdrew its last factory fleets from the North Pacific. And shortly thereafter, there's a worldwide moratorium on industrial whaling. And I'm going to stop there, but first kind of mention two kind of ironies that I see in this story. One is that the socialist program, which starts off with such a dedication to the idea that it's going to kind of transcend the problems of capitalism, does not end up able to do so. They're no more able to kind of acknowledge the necessity of whales alive than 19th century market whalers had been. And the other is that the kind of socialist excesses and the tendency to only see whales as valuable when dead did not in the end even support the kind of Soviet dream of ever expanding production because of the sort of biological nature of whales themselves that could not keep up with Soviet demands. And I will stop there.
Great, so thanks for both of those presentations. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience soon, so please do put the questions in the Q&A function if you'd like. But before that, I was wondering if the two of you could sort of speak to each other for a little bit about what about connections or provocations that the two presentations have between each other, and although they're very different moments, sort of how these two relatively long-term episodes of exploitation and extraction in this same area relate to one another.
Okay, Bathsheba, I wanted to ask you a fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed the talk. I learned quite a bit from it. I was wondering if you could comment. So one of the things that strikes me is that some of the stuff that you were talking about when you're talking about the whaling program and how it just in seemingly irrational it was from an economic point of view, and became more so that a lot of it seemed to operate eventually on the kind of inertia. But one thing that strikes me also is that perhaps, and it's very difficult to get at perhaps with sources, but from the point of view of people, let's say, living in the Far East, from the point of view of the people working on these ships, right, and getting these jobs, some of which were, I would venture to say, were pretty considered to be pretty prestigious, right? If you're living in a village in Siberia somewhere, and you get to go into the ocean and become a harpoonist, or even a part of the support staff on these whales, so it must have been pretty from the point of view of like a macro scale, you're talking about fulfilling the Gosplan, and they're also rationalizing with all kinds of kind of communist vision and other kind of visions. But from the point of view of individual workers, there seems to have been sort of an understandable, perhaps, motivation to be involved in this program, and then to become a worker on a whaling ship like this. And leave your community, and also lucrative probably, right, in terms of how much money you earn versus if you were not involved in it. I was wondering if you could speak from that point of view, from the point of view of the actual people involved, and there were many of them, of course, and how they would make their careers. And then the point of view, I think also, it seems like once you have this in place, right, it's almost like the way it almost takes on a logic of its own, but you have to go on, because if you cancel it, it becomes like yet one more opportunity to make a living in a place where there are so few opportunities. One of the reasons why it seems like a lot of people today in some of these forlorn, isolated parts of Russia, people want to work in prisons, for example, because it's one of the few economic opportunities for them, right? And even though it seems, it seems, well, it's an economic magnet, in other words, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you, because I actually this talk had to move pretty quickly, so I didn't really talk about the specific motivations for joining these whale ships, but certainly and this is something that Ryan Jones's book talks about more fully, because he talks about the Antarctic voyages. These were really prestigious jobs, because not only were they well paid and you were sort of supported when you were on the ship, everything was taken care of. Even if the ships were sometimes kind of, hot or cold or bug infested places to live, you weren't paying rent when you were on them. You weren't paying for your meals. They also went to foreign ports of call. So, they had this kind of extra level of prestige that if you were going to Antarctica, they regularly stopped in New Zealand. They were sometimes in other parts of the Pacific, which, wasn't easy to do, particularly if you lived in Vladivostok, which was a closed city. There wasn't a lot of opportunity. So they were extremely prestigious jobs. If you were a very good harpooner, or some of these other positions, they were really well paid. And I think you can definitely see that kind of industrial inertia that is, it's certainly not a Soviet issue, right? It's like, it's why we support coal mines when we know that particular industry is in fact no longer all that competitive at a market level. It's incredibly destructive to the people who work in it at a health level. And then there's of course, the environmental impact. So I think there is a way in which the Soviet whaling program gets really kicked off right about when other countries are starting to draw down. And it hits its peak at this moment where it's really out of sync with what capitalist nations are doing. And it just kind of continues under the weight of its own sort of massive fleet. And the fact that these were good jobs for the people who had them. I had a question for you. I'm really interested in your new research because I'm attempting to learn something about the Russian American company for my next book. And I was interested about ways in which the kind of corporate model, what is the reception in St. Petersburg? Is it, imperial Russia has really kind of complicated relationships with the idea of capitalism and the kinds of models put forward by other empires. And I was just curious as to what you're finding in terms of how people in St. Petersburg and other kinds of investors are thinking about this venture. Are they suspicious of it? On what grounds? You kind of mentioned that. I was curious.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a good question. I have to say, this is only tentative, but I think in general, the relationship in the center to Russian American company is very ambiguous. And so on the one hand, there is it's a joint venture with the government, and there are people, including the Tsar's family and many nobles, who invest in the Russian American company and are part of it in this way. And it's there, but there's a distance with which it's viewed, and so I think it's very telling that when you finally have this level of transparency in the way things are discussed in the Russian Empire in the 1850s, 1860s, Morskoy Sbornik, which is one of the most leading newspapers at the time in terms of it's almost like the Aganyok, what Aganyok was in 1980s, 1990s. Morskoy Sbornik was to the glasnost of the Alexander II's Russia, right? And there's a long campaign there to discredit the Russian American company in the 1850s, 1860s, early 1860s. This is not related necessarily to the sale of Alaska, but more to identify the Russian American company with serfdom and the way that their comparing treatment of the Aleuts to and the other workers of the native workers of the company to the position of serfs, which is in some ways misleading because it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing, but it's almost like it's because Russia recently had undergone, or is undergoing at that time, late 1850s and 1861 and afterwards, right, is getting rid of serfdom. That certainly there's an exploitation there, is what I'm saying, but it's not the same as serfdom, not quite the same. But the idea of the bondage of these workers becomes tied into. But the point is that it's not. It seems like some of that is written, genuinely from the point of view of people concerned with the natives in the province. But some of that is a little bit. In other words, it's debates that are going on in the center that are only somewhat loosely related on what's actually going on in the Russian American company. So when you get these sort of exchanges in Morskoy Sbornik and other journals that are going on, often it's the dialogue is very stilted. It's like they're not speaking to each other, but there are different factions. In other words, one it's about serfdom, but it's also about economic liberalism. That is a value by some people in the imperial apparatus that are attacking the Russian American company. And what they really want is a liberalization, as they call it, an opportunity for other merchants and other people in the empire so that it's not a monopoly, but different merchants can then exploit the native population, right? And so in a way, and then the Russian American company defends itself saying, well, they're actually they're on paternalistic grounds, that they're actually treating people relatively well, and that others, if you have a laissez-faire relationship in this colony, the exploitation would be much worse. That's what the argument they make, which anyway, but it's interesting that it's a kind of a removed argument in some ways. The economic liberal argument is a little bit about something that's going on in St. Petersburg and not so much actually events that are going on the ground. It's very removed. So so it's very so I think there's I think that to people in the center in St. Petersburg at the time, the Russian American company is you know, if you think about even the way that the phrase is made, американские колонии, российские колонии в Америке, right? It's a kind of like, it's explicitly saying that these are colonies, first of all. This is not part of, like, they don't call, you know, people call Siberia colony, but that's not the official Soviet line. I'm sorry, Russian imperial line. But this is like explicitly, and it's also far away, в Америке, right? So that when it's sold off, it's much easier for them to get rid of it. So because it's so distant from them. So so I would say there is a very ambiguous relationship to them, to the colonies. The people that actually go there, you know, they have a much more closer connection to it, and who invest their careers in Russian America, they treasure it. But from the other people in St. Petersburg, they see it as something that is a kind of a disposable contractor, almost like of empire. So yeah, so that's the best I can answer at this point, but maybe we can go on later. Thank you.
That's so fascinating. It's interesting that these criticisms are in some ways similar to earlier criticisms of the British East India Company on lines of liberalism and what kind of commerce it makes possible or doesn't. But I think I have some questions for both of you, but I think I'm going to take some from the chat or from the Q&A. Just the first question, Professor Demuth, which you also sort of started to touch on, is a question from Muling He. It says, to what extent did the whaling industry benefit the native communities on the Soviet Union's Pacific coast? And were indigenous Siberians actively participating in the industry or protesting it? I guess what was the relationship or the incorporation of native Siberians in the whaling industry?
That's a great question. Thank you. So there's kind of two things that happen with whaling in the Russian Far East, and particularly in the Bering Sea, in regards to indigenous whalers. So Yupik and Chukchi communities have been whaling along that side of the Bering Strait for thousands and thousands of years. And the Soviet Union, particularly after the Second World War, wants to, quote, rationalize the way that whaling is taking place. And that actually, by the 1960s and 70s, means that native communities are not allowed to conduct their own whaling. All of the whales that are used by Chukchi and Yupik communities are killed by like a small version of one of those factory ships at sea, and they're drug in to these communities. And the number of whales that are killed goes up quite a bit. It's mostly gray whales that are being harvested, and they're used to feed fox farms at kind of a level that was in excess of what native communities were using prior to that. And that those ships, for the most part, did not use indigenous labor, the kind of miniature factory ships. So there's a real kind of loss of capacity around shore-based whaling in native communities. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's actually a delegation from Alaska native whaling communities that comes over to Chukotka to kind of teach people how to do that whaling again. And today, the Chukchi and Yupik communities along the coastline in Chukotka have a quota from the International Whaling Commission and kill around 120 gray whales a year and a few bowhead whales for their communities. But they've kind of come back to that tradition after this hiatus under the Soviets. And on the big factory ships, there's very, very few native whalers. It was really kind of a practice that was taken away from those communities after the Second World War, and then it goes back after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Maybe I could ask a follow-up on that question. You sort of mentioned a loss of knowledge and then a re-education or regaining of whaling knowledge in these indigenous communities. And I've seen you write and present before on the perceptions of whales and other wildlife that some of these peoples have. Was there any sort of I don't know, reaction to the way the Soviet whaling industry was conducted among these communities, or or the way that the whales might have perceived that? Have you found anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a place where the kind of written record is a little spotty because people, of course, were not necessarily eager to jump up and down about what they wanted to critique about Soviet production. But there are places, and particularly the work by anthropologists in Chukotka and at the very end of the Soviet Union and the immediate post-Soviet period, where Yupik and Chukchi communities are very critical of the Soviet program. They're critical because of the scale. They think there are too many whales and also walruses. There's concern about overharvesting, and there's also concern about the treatment of the animals during hunting, that it really goes against the ways in which, even communities that are prohibited from hunting, have learned or have been told that is appropriate for interacting. And the Soviets had a particular habit of dragging gray whale carcasses inland to feed these fox farms with tractors. And it very much goes against the understanding of what a dead whale requires from a community to move its bones away from the coastline. Like, to treat the animal with respect, you keep its bones close to the sea, and that's how its soul goes home, essentially. And so the Soviet practice of pulling whales away from the coast was really critiqued, and critiqued openly enough that anthropologists were aware of it.
That's really interesting. So I'll take another question. We have a question from Justin Burke for Ilya he writes, ultimately, why did the Imperial Russian government decide to sell Alaska to the United States, not the British? And was Alaska sold with or against the wishes of the Russian-American company?
Okay, thank you for that question. Yes, ultimately, first of all, you have to remember that in the 1860s, the Russian Empire was still in the throes of thinking in terms of what happened in the Crimean War in the 1850s, in which, of course, Britain was the opponent, in one of the opponents in the Crimean War, and there was a secret treaty during the Crimean War that excluded America. That is the coast of what is today British Columbia and Alaska, with Hudson Bay Company and a Russian-American company, that excluded them from the war, because during that time, basically, the consensus by the Russian Navy was that one or two British ships, if they came into Sitka Harbor, which was called New Archangel at the time, and pointed a gun at the fort there, Alaska would be conquered, essentially, because there were only about 500 Russian people from Eurasia, from the Russian Empire, that were actually in Alaska at the time. There were some Cossacks that were sent. Anyway, there were less than 1,000 people altogether. And of course, there were, and so there were very few people there to defend it, potentially. So anyway, what I'm trying, in the 1860s, so the answer is that Alaska was almost given for free or for a very low price to the Americans in order to spite the British. That's the answer. That at that point, and at that point also, by the way, so Russian-American, it was done behind Russian-American companies' back. This was done completely by the government, secretly from Russian-American company. However, the Russian Navy, which had a good deal of say, and that was represented at the meeting in December 1866 about the need to sell the Alaska to the Americans. At that point, the Navy was, in support of selling Alaska, in part because the other thing that happened is that in the late 1850s, 1860s, Russia got a large chunk of territory in Primorsky Krai, in what is today Vladivostok, Nakhotka, and there were places there that were much more suitable for a port for the Russian-American company. I'm sorry, for the Russian Navy. And so one of the things about Sitka before that is that it was the only really serviceable, decent port for large-scale vessels in the Russian Far East, if you will, because the other ports like Okhotsk and Ayan were the two ports that were used by the Russian American company. They had some serious problems. That's why they switched at one point from Okhotsk to Ayan. They were remote. There were problems of getting the ships there at different times of the year. Whereas now that they had what would become Vladivostok and Nakhotka, those were far better ports and far more strategic, right? Also, with protected waters and close to the markets of Asia that were a big draw for Russia. So essentially, the short story is that Alaska was almost given away to the United States, in part to spite Britain, and in part to put Britain in bind in its North American geopolitical ambitions. And so it's not a complete coincidence that at the same time that you have the same year, 1867, that you have the sale of Alaska, you also have the Confederation of Canada being formed, which leads to the unification of, eventually of the west coast of Canada, British Columbia, and East Canada together into a single entity in order to prevent an invasion from the United States. And when Seward, the American Secretary of State, was buying Alaska, the idea was, that he wanted British Columbia as well. Okay, that's the short answer there.
That's a lot to put in such a short answer, but well done. But I also have a question for you, Ilya, and so that I wanted to ask, and there has been a lot of work on natural philosophers and explorers and scientists who participate in expeditions under the Russian Empire to Siberia and to the Russian North Pacific. And I was wondering sort of how your relocation of the Russian America Company into the context of other European or Western European colonial companies changes the way we might see those figures. I mean, are they sort of, what's their relationship with the company, I suppose would be one question. I know that some of them are critical of the company's practices, but if the company has some kind of authority that's similar to state authority in these areas, then do these figures look, more like independent agents, or more like state servitors, or more like company servitors? What's the relationship between the state, the Russian state, if it's mediated through the company, or if the company has more authority out there than we're used to thinking about?
Well, that's a very good question. I haven't been thinking about that specifically. Of course, there are some of the big exploration efforts are before the founding of the Russian American Company, so the previous century, and those are important. And of course, in terms of the discoveries and things that they do, and we're beginning with the Bering explorations and several missions that are made before. I think the establishment of the Russian American Company, which happens just at the turn of the century, 1799, changes the relationship somewhat between the entire far east of the empire and St. Petersburg. It creates a different route of communication that is quicker and more efficient. At the same time, so you have, there are different people who are different scientists like Voznесensky and some others who come to Alaska and work for the Russian American Company later, and scientists and so some of them. So I think it really varies. Some of them who, for example, Zagoskin, whom I know Bathsheba knows about because he's a primary explorer of the Yukon in the 1840s. So in a way they are, I would say, in terms of when they're actually in Alaska, these people they have a certain independence because they have their own, for example, in the case of Zagoskin, he has his own, mandate and his own job to do. But yet, when he is in the Russian-American company, and he's also doing work for the Russian-American company because they're hoping to use his exploration of the Yukon, for example, to further their agenda. So he becomes a kind of a contractor of a contractor, if you will, in terms of what he is, the economic utility, if you will, of what he's doing. At the same time, he is also participating in world science. So it's a kind of and science in a kind of a broader scheme of things, right? So he as a scholar, as a discoverer. So there are multiple things going on here. So the relationship to the Russian-American company and what it is accomplishing is one thing, and his own positioning as a scholar and as a discoverer is something different. I don't think it's necessarily easy to group them together in that way. But I think the Russian-American company does introduce a new element of contracting that isn't there before the Russian-American company exists, in which this space is much more kind of the open frontier. And in the case of somebody like Zagoskin, he ventures into territories that is clearly not, Russia claims, right, but doesn't control in any meaningful way whatsoever. So in a way, they're both different. In other words, I think both Zagoskin in this case and the Russian-American company are contractors of an empire, and they interact and they relate to each other, but they both have their contracts primarily with somebody else or some other, the imperial state, in other words, gives them that right. Although clearly they also have, what Zagoskin does has also benefits for the Russian-American company, very much so. Yes. So I hope that helps answer some of that. I think you have to look at the individual explorers and how they end up there. And of course, some of them are very critical, and you also have to look at their own motivations and why they're there. But some of them are critical from the point of view of, wanting to, from something like economic liberalism or positioning a Russian empire as a, in other words, some of them are there to critique colonialism in general. And some of them, and most of them, I would say, are there to try to make colonialism more efficient, quote unquote. So they critique the Russian-American company because they want to reform it or they want to replace it with some other mechanism, but not necessarily because they are critical of the colonial project as a whole. Does that make sense?
Definitely. So we're sort of running low on time, so I thought I would take two questions now from the Q&A. Both are for Bathsheba. There's a question from Mary Nicholas that asks about the conservationist mindset that you sort of described in your presentation in the 1930s, the early sort of phase of the Soviet whaling program that's prior to the one that you mainly discussed. So just a question about that. And then there's a question on the connection between Soviet and Japanese whaling. And I was sort of wondering about this too, if there's any collaboration between the two industries, or if there are maybe conflicts between them, if they're in similar waters.
Yeah, those are both great questions. The question of the 1930s, and I was not precise about this in my talk, but it's basically the marine biology that's being done in the late 1920s and into the early 1930s is the one that's kind of speaking to this idea of creating a program that's able to kind of transcend the problems of capitalism. And in some ways, because they're only operating with one fleet, the Aluit, rather than with kind of this global reach, there's an ability to shift between whale species while still kind of making a growing Soviet plan. So for a little while, it actually looks like it works because basically the capacity of the Soviet Union is not huge. And I think because the kind of anti-capitalist framing of the word conservation is never used, right? It's not put in those terms, it's put in the terms of being more rational and kind of more capable than capitalists had ever been. And that meant that, when the Aleut started to kill gray whales that seemed to be immature, that were too small, indicating that the population was under stress, they would start looking at other species, and they would still be able to kind of meet the quotas. The question about Japan and the Soviet Union, I feel like I really only have half of that picture, and probably not even half of it, because I don't work in Japanese. I would love to collaborate with a historian who can actually work in Japan's archives, if they're open about the whaling program. I don't know. For the kind of post-war period, even though Japan and the Soviet Union really are often working in the same waters, there's actually a certain amount of collaboration, because Japan, it seems, was also killing in excess of the IWC's rules. And at some point, the IWC puts in place a program where you need an observer from a different country on your ship to kind of keep track of whether or not you are whaling in accordance with the IWC limits. And so the Soviet Union and Japan would swap observers, and thus would both be able to whale in the ways that they wanted to. And kind of later in the Soviet period, Japan was actually a major market for whale meat. It was exported to Japan. So I think there were kind of moments of tension, particularly around the Kuril Islands, where there were shore whaling stations, but there was actually also quite a bit of cooperation, kind of surprisingly in some ways, because they had recently been at war, but kind of in response to pressures from, I think in many ways from the United States, which does not have a whaling program in the 20th century of any size, and yet is kind of presiding over the International Whaling Commission in ways that really rankled many countries that participated.
Right, so we're just about out of time, unless there are any other questions from the audience or anything that either of you would like to say. I'd just like to thank both of you for being here and for these great presentations and the discussion that we had, and to thank all of the attendees who came out today. And I just say that we hope you will join us for the last event in this series for this year on April 15th, again at 2 p.m., which is a different time, on the Second World War with Michael David Fox and Francine Hirsch. And I'll just say again, please do support the striking workers at Columbia, and solidarity with them, or with us. And thank you all for being here again. And take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to end on the fact that I think, just very briefly, that Bathsheba talked about what she talked about, how the whaling was, in some sense, the relationship between the whaling, the industrial whaling, and the indigenous community of Siberia. You can make the same parallels, I think, between what the Russians were doing in the Aleutian Islands to the Aleuts. In other words, the sea otters in that case, right? And how they were using them in some ways, but then they completely destroyed the way that it was done before, and overwhelmed the whole system and destroyed the populations in that area. And and then later had to be, reintroduced in a different way. That's it. Thank you.